Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going back to the roots of psychology, cracking open Wilhelm Wundt's Principles of Physiological Psychology.
Oh, a classic.
Yeah, it can be a bit dense, but it's packed with insights, really foundational stuff for understanding the mind and the brain.
Absolutely. This book, published back in 1874, it was like the blueprint for experimental psychology as we know it today.
So Wundt, he was really this pioneer in applying the scientific method to psychology.
Yeah.
What were some of the big ideas he was wrestling with?
Well, back then, one of the big debates was, could psychology even be a science? Some people thought the mind was just too subjective, too squishy. But Wundt, he argued that we could actually study mental processes scientifically through careful observation, experiments, and physiological measurements.
So he was pushing back against the idea that psychology was all just armchair philosophy and speculation.
Exactly. He wanted psychology to be a rigorous empirical science, on par with physics or chemistry.
An experimental method was a huge part of that.
Huge. He believed it was applicable to all of individual psychology, both directly and indirectly.
Oh, that's interesting. What did he mean by indirectly?
Well, he thought the insights from those controlled lab experiments could also inform our observations in more natural settings, like applying the principles you learn in a chem lab to understand how ingredients interact in your kitchen.
Makes sense. Bridging the gap between the lab and real-world experience. I like that. He also seemed to have some strong opinions on this idea of psychophysical materialism, right?
Oh, yeah, he really took issue with that.
Well, maybe what that is again.
It's the idea that all mental processes are just byproducts of, physical processes in the brain, and that the only way to understand the mind is through physiology.
So it's kind of a reductionist view.
Very much so. And Wundt, he argued that while physiology is essential, it can't tell the whole story. He believed there's a level of mental causation that can't be fully explained by purely physical means.
So like a holistic view of the mind-body relationship.
Precisely. They're intertwined, but you can't just reduce one to the other.
Do you have any good examples of how this interplay works in practice?
Oh, yeah. He talked about visual perception, how our understanding of the subjective experience of seeing, like color or depth, can actually inform theories about the physiological processes of light hitting the eye and vice versa.
Ah, that's a good one. Makes me think about how relevant that still is today, right? Neuroscientists still use psychological observations to help interpret brain activity.
Oh, absolutely. It's a two-way street.
Speaking of how we understand the mind, Wundt also took on this traditional faculty model of the mind. The idea that the mind's divided into these separate compartments, like memory, reason, and sensation.
Right, like little boxes in the brain.
Exactly. Did he buy into that?
Not really. He questioned whether it really captured the dynamic, interconnected nature of mental life. He saw the mind as way more fluid and integrated.
It's like he was foreshadowing some of those more modern theories of cognition, distributed cognition or neural networks.
Yeah.
Recognizing that the mind isn't just a bunch of isolated modules, but this complex, interconnected system.
Exactly. He was already laying the groundwork for a more holistic and dynamic view of the mind way back then.
It's amazing how ahead of his time he was. Another area where that really shines through is his discussion of evolution.
Oh, yeah. He was fascinated by how the evolution of organisms connected to the increasing complexity of mental functions.
Like he pointed to the nervous system as a prime example, going from those simple nerve nets in, primitive organisms to the intricate human brain.
Right. And he saw this increasing complexity as directly linked to more sophisticated mental abilities.
So he was kind of like a proto-evolutionary psychologist in a way, thinking about how our cognitive abilities evolved to help us survive.
You could say that. He was definitely a pioneer in linking biology and psychology.
And then there's the neuron theory, which he was an early adopter of.
That one was huge. It states that neurons are the building blocks of the nervous system, and that information flows in a specific direction within those neurons, from the dendrites, which receive signals, to the axon, which transmits them.
So that fundamental principle of neuroscience, he was already onto it back in the 19th century.
He was, and his understanding of how information flows directionally laid the foundation for how we study neural communication today.
And once he had those basics down, he really dove deep into the actual mechanics of how nerves work.
Oh yeah, he explored everything, from the role of chemical processes in nerve excitation to how energy is transformed within the nerve to generate those signals.
I remember reading about his distinction between internal and external molecular work. I gotta admit, that one tripped me up a bit at first.
It is a tricky concept. Think of it like a factory. Internal work keeps the lights on and the machines running, while external work is producing and shipping the actual products.
Ah, okay, now that makes sense. So the nerve needs energy for both maintaining itself and for communicating with the rest of the system.
Exactly. Wundt was really trying to understand both sides of that coin.
It's like he was trying to crack the code of how these tiny units of the nervous system all work together to create the mind.
And he didn't shy away from the complexity. He also looked at the effects of stimulating nerves repeatedly, how practice can make a nerve more excitable, and how fatigue can make it less so.
So he was already thinking about the nervous system as this dynamic, adaptive system.
Absolutely. He was way ahead of his time in recognizing that.
Then there's inhibition, right, which is just as important as excitation.
Oh, crucial. It's not just about signals being sent. Sometimes they need to be stopped or suppressed.
It's like a symphony orchestra. You need both the instruments playing and moments of silence.
Perfect analogy.
Hmm.
Wundt found that stimulating certain areas of the brain could actually inhibit reflexes. It really fascinated him, how different stimuli could either enhance or inhibit reflexes, depending on how they interacted.
So the nervous system is not just about sending signals, but it's about controlling and regulating them too.
Exactly. He found that things like timing, intensity, even the spatial location of stimuli could all influence whether a reflex was enhanced or inhibited.
And the overall state of the nervous system matter too, right?
Oh, definitely. A tired or damaged system might be less able to inhibit those reflexes. It's like when you're exhausted, it's much harder to resist that extra piece of cake. Your inhibitory control is just weaker.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. He's talking about neural networks and this balance of excitation and inhibition back in the 1800s. Amazing. It really lays the groundwork for how we understand the brain today.
He really did. And to make things even more complex, he even explored this concept of neuron territories. The idea that each neuron has its own functional zone of influence within the network.
Okay, wait, neuron territories? I'm not sure I follow.
Think of it like countries with borders. Each country controls what happens within its territory.
Okay, I get that.
Well, neurons have these territories too. They influence the flow of information within their zone based on how they're connected to other neurons. The direction of information flow isn't just determined by the nerve fibers themselves, but also by the properties of those neurons at either end of the fiber.
So it's like a super complex network of roads, with each neuron acting like a traffic intersection, directing the flow of signals based on its connections and the traffic signals within its territory.
That's a great analogy. And Wundt, he was trying to map out these intricate traffic patterns of the nervous system, understanding how information flows and is processed within these neuronal territories.
That's, wow, incredibly complex. Did he have any thoughts on what type of energy was driving all this activity in the nervous system?
He did explore this concept of nerve energy,
Yeah.
but his ideas were limited by the scientific knowledge at the time. Today we understand that nerve signals are primarily electrochemical, a combination of electrical and chemical processes.
Right, so his specific ideas about nerve energy might be outdated, but what's fascinating is that he was already wrestling with this fundamental notion of how energy is transformed and transmitted within the nervous system.
He was, and his vision of the nervous system as this incredibly complex web of interconnected elements, each contributing to the flow and transformation of energy, that was really ahead of its time.
He really did seem to get so much right, it's amazing. But did he ever try to tackle the biggest mystery of all, consciousness?
He did, and this is where things get really interesting. Because while he championed using scientific methods to study the mind, he also acknowledged that those methods had limits when it came to understanding consciousness.
So he recognized there was this gap between what we can objectively observe about the brain and this subjective experience of being conscious.
Exactly. He argued that while we can study the physiological things going on during conscious experience, what's happening in the brain, we can never fully explain the feeling of what it's like to be conscious just through those physical means.
It's like trying to explain what the color red looks like to someone who's been blind their whole life, right?
That's the perfect analogy. Wundt was basically saying there's something fundamentally mysterious about consciousness that goes beyond our current scientific understanding.
It's cool that he was both a rigorous scientist and a bit of a philosopher, recognizing the boundaries of what we can know.
He was a true visionary. And this tension between the objective and subjective realms of the mind, that's still a central debate in consciousness research today.
So we've been exploring these foundational areas of the brainstem, cerebellum, even dipped into the midbrain and diencephalon. But now it's time to venture into the realm where Wundt really, really got excited, the cerebral cortex.
Yeah, cortex. Now we're talking this thin outermost layer. That's what really sets us apart, from other animals. It's where all the higher cognitive functions happen. Language, reasoning, decision-making. It's what makes us human.
It's like the crown jewel of brain evolution. But how did Wundt even begin to, like, unravel the mysteries of such a complex structure?
Well, he was incredibly meticulous in his approach. He used both stimulation and ablation techniques to try and map out the different functional areas of the cortex.
Mhm.
And remember, this is the 19th century, way before fMRI and EEG, so, pretty amazing what he was able to do.
Yeah, walk us through those techniques. How do they actually work?
So imagine being able to, like, gently stimulate different parts of the brain and just watch what happens. That's essentially what Wundt and his contemporaries did. They'd apply these weak electrical currents to certain areas of the cortex and very carefully document the results. It was like they were teasing out the secrets of the brain, one tiny electrical pulse at a time.
And that's how they figured out things like the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, right?
Exactly. The motor cortex, up in the frontal lobe, that controls voluntary movements. Wundt found that stimulating different spots within the motor cortex produced movements in specific parts of the body. Like he had this map of the body laid out on the surface of the brain.
Right, which is where we get that weird-looking motor homunculus, right?
Yeah.
That figure with the giant hands and lips.
Uh-huh, yes. It's like
So-
a funhouse mirror reflection of the human body. But it illustrates a really important point. The brain dedicates more processing power to those parts of the body that need really fine motor control. Our hands, for instance, can do incredibly precise movements, and that's reflected in how much space they take up on the brain map.
So bigger hands on the homunculus means more brain power dedicated to them.
Exactly. And what about ablation? What did he learn from actually removing parts of the cortex?
Yeah, that seems a little more intense.
It was a more drastic technique, that's for sure. But it provided even more evidence for the localization of function in the brain. So by surgically removing these small sections of the cortex, Wundt and other researchers could actually see how behavior changed. For example, if they removed a certain part of the motor cortex, that could lead to paralysis or weakness in a specific body part.
Wow, so they were literally mapping the brain by seeing what stopped working when they took pieces out.
Pretty much. And they found similar maps for the sensory cortex, too.
Oh, right. The sensory cortex, that's over in the parietal lobe, right? It's like the main hub for all the sensory information coming in from the body.
Yeah, like a giant switchboard.
Yeah.
Wundt and his colleagues discovered that different parts of the sensory cortex are responsible for processing things like touch, temperature, pain, and pressure from specific parts of the body.
So is there like a sensory homunculus too? Is it as strange looking as the motor one?
It is. And just like with the motor homunculus, the size of each body part on the sensory cortex, it corresponds to how sensitive that part is. Areas like our fingertips and lips, those have way more sensory receptors, so they get bigger representations than less sensitive areas, like the back or elbows.
It's like the brain is giving those areas with more sensory input a higher resolution, like a high-definition camera for your most important senses.
That's a great analogy. And Wundt, he didn't just stop there. He also made big contributions to our understanding of the visual and auditory areas of the cortex.
Oh,
Confirming that the visual cortex in the occipital lobe is processing visual information, and the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe is processing auditory information.
it's amazing how he was able to trace those pathways, how information travels from the eyes and the ears all the way to those specific parts of the brain. He was like a neural detective.
Really. And his investigations went even deeper,
Yeah.
He started to explore this concept of association centers, areas of the cortex that aren't directly involved in sensory or motor processing, but seem to, like, integrate information from multiple sources.
So was he suggesting that there are parts of the brain that are doing more than just processing basic senses and actions? Like, are these the areas that give us those higher level cognitive functions, the things that make us different from other animals?
Exactly. He was one of the first to really grasp that concept, that some parts of the brain go beyond just reacting to the world. They're involved in things like thinking, planning. Association centers, they were like the early version of what we now call the prefrontal cortex, the executive control center of the brain.
It's just incredible to think that Wundt, working with, much simpler tools, was able to lay the foundation for so much of what we understand about the brain today.
It really is a testament to his genius. But let's not forget that Wundt was also really interested in the more fundamental mechanisms of the nervous system itself. He didn't just focus on those big picture functions.
Okay, yeah, let's go back to the basics for a minute. What else was he looking at in terms of how nerves actually work?
Well, he was one of the first to really emphasize the importance of inhibition, not just excitation, in the nervous system. It's not enough for neurons to just fire. They also need to be able to stop or suppress those signals when necessary.
Right, like a traffic system. You need both green lights and red lights to keep things moving smoothly.
Exactly. Wundt actually found that if you stimulate certain areas of the brain, you can inhibit reflexes. He was really interested in how different stimuli can kind of interfere with each other, either making a reflex stronger or weaker depending on how they interact.
So the nervous system isn't just about sending signals out, it's about carefully controlling those signals too. What kinds of things did he find influence that process?
He discovered that the timing of the stimuli, how strong they are, and even where they are in space, all of those things could influence whether a reflex gets enhanced or inhibited.
So it's not just the strength of one signal, but the whole context, how it interacts with other signals in the system.
Precisely. And he also noticed that the overall state of the nervous system matters too. A system that's fatigued or that's been damaged, it might not be as good at inhibiting reflexes. Like when you're tired, it's harder to resist those temptations.
Yeah, that makes sense. He was basically talking about neural networks and this interplay of excitation and inhibition way back in the 1800s. It's really remarkable how much his work foreshadows our modern understanding of the brain.
It is. And then, just to add another layer of complexity, he even explored this concept of neuron territories. The idea that each neuron has its own little zone of influence within the network.
Your own territories. Okay, you're going to have to explain that one.
Okay, so think of it like, you know how countries have borders
Yeah.
and they control what happens within their territory?
Yeah, I got it.
Well, neurons kind of have these territories too. They actively influence the flow of information in their zone based on how they're connected to other neurons. The direction that information flows isn't just determined by the nerve fibers themselves, but also by the properties of the neurons on either end of that fiber.
So it's like a super complex highway system with each neuron acting as a traffic controller, directing the flow of signals based on its connections and the signals within its territory.
You got it. And he was trying to map out those traffic patterns, understanding how information moves and is processed within those neuronal territories.
It's all so incredibly complex. It makes you wonder, did Wundt have any ideas about what type of energy was driving all this activity in the nervous system?
He did actually explore this concept of nerve energy, but of course, his ideas were limited by the scientific knowledge of the time. We now know that nerve signals are mostly electrochemical in nature. It's a combination of electrical and chemical processes.
Right, so his specific ideas about nerve energy might be a bit outdated, but what's fascinating is that he was already trying to grapple with this fundamental question of how energy is transformed and transmitted within the nervous system.
He was. And his vision of the nervous system as this amazingly complex web of interconnected elements, each contributing to that flow and transformation of energy, that was really ahead of its time. He was already laying the groundwork for our modern understanding of neural networks and information processing.
It's incredible how much he got right. But there's one big question I still have. Did he ever tackle the big one, consciousness?
He did. And this is where his work gets even more fascinating because, while he was a huge advocate for the scientific method, he also recognized that it had limitations when it came to understanding consciousness.
So he was acknowledging that there's this gap between what we can objectively observe about the brain and the actual subjective feeling of being conscious.
Yeah, precisely. He argued that we can study what's going on in the brain during conscious experiences, but we can never fully explain the feeling of what it's like to be conscious just through those physical measurements and observations.
It's like trying to explain what the color red looks like to someone who's been blind their whole life, right? You can describe the wavelengths of light, but you can't actually convey the experience of seeing red.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Wundt was essentially saying that there's something about consciousness, something fundamental and mysterious that's beyond our current scientific grasp.
I really admired that about him. He was this rigorous scientist, but he was also humble enough to acknowledge the limits of what we can know.
He was a true visionary. And this tension between the objective and subjective realms of the mind, it remains a core debate in consciousness research today.
It really makes you wonder, how much progress have we actually made on that front since Wundt's time? We've got these incredible brain scanners now and powerful computers, but can we really say that we understand how those subjective experiences arise from the physical stuff of the brain?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Wundt's work really serves as a powerful reminder that even as we make these huge leaps forward in neuroscience, There will always be these deep mysteries that push us to keep searching, to keep expanding our understanding of what it means to be human.
Okay, so we've made it. After that incredible journey through the evolutionary layers of the brain, from the brainstem up through the midbrain, we're finally here. The cerebral cortex. This is it, the main event. What did Wundt find in this mysterious wrinkled landscape?
It's in the cortex that we really see his passion for scientific exploration. It really shines through. Remember, this was way before fMRI and EEG.
Right, yeah.
So he had to rely on much simpler techniques, things like stimulation and ablation, to try to figure out what the different areas of the cortex actually did.
Okay, remind me again. How did those techniques work? And what did they tell him about the cortex?
Well, imagine you're like a cartographer, right? Mapping out a vast new continent.
Okay, yeah.
That's kind of what Wundt was doing, except instead of mountains and rivers, he was mapping the mind. Stimulation involved applying these tiny electrical currents, very weak, to certain areas of the cortex and just observing what happened. If you stimulate a spot and the subject's arm twitches, well, you found a region involved in motor control.
It's like a little zap to the brain and you see what happens.
Exactly. And through this really careful stimulation, he was able to pinpoint some key areas, like the motor cortex, which is responsible for all of our voluntary movements,
Yeah.
and the sensory cortex, which is where all that information from our senses comes in.
Right, and that's how he came up with those funny-looking homunculi, right? The motor and sensory maps of the body kind of laid out on the brain.
Yes. The motor homunculus, the one with the giant hands and lips, it shows us that the amount of space a body part gets on the cortex really reflects how important it is for fine motor control.
Yeah.
We need more brain power for things like playing the piano or making really detailed facial expressions.
So bigger hands on the homunculus, more brain power dedicated to hand movements. Got it.
Exactly.
What about ablation, though? That seems a little more extreme. What did he learn from actually removing parts of the cortex?
Yeah, it was definitely a more drastic technique, but it gave them more evidence for this idea of the localization of function in the brain. So by surgically removing small pieces of the cortex, Wundt and his colleagues could then see how behavior changed. For example, removing a part of the motor cortex, that could cause paralysis or weakness in a specific body part.
It's amazing they were able to make those connections, figure out what part of the brain controlled what by taking bits out and seeing what stopped working.
It's pretty incredible when you think about it.
Mhm.
And they found similar maps for the sensory cortex, too.
Oh, right. The sensory cortex, that's in the parietal lobe, right? It's like the big switchboard, taking in all that sensory information from the body.
Yeah, it is. Wundt and his colleagues discovered that different areas within the sensory cortex are responsible for processing things like touch, temperature, pain, pressure, all from specific parts of the body.
So is there a sensory homunculus too? Is it as weird looking as the motor one?
Oh, it is. And just like with the motor one, the size of each body part on that sensory map, it directly corresponds to how sensitive that part is.
Hmm.
Areas like our fingertips and lips, those have tons of sensory receptors, so they get a much bigger representation on the sensory cortex than, say, our elbows.
Makes sense. Our brain prioritizes those areas that give us the most information about the world. It's like having a super high definition camera for your most important senses.
I love that analogy. And he didn't stop there. He also made really important contributions to our understanding of the visual and auditory areas of the cortex, confirming that the visual cortex in the occipital lobe processes visual information, and the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe processes auditory information.
Yeah, and he was able to actually trace those pathways, how information travels from the eyes and the ears all the way to those specific parts of the brain. He was like a brain detective.
He really was. But what's even more fascinating is that his investigations went even further. He started to explore these association centers, which are areas of the cortex that aren't directly involved with, sensory or motor processing, but they seem to integrate information from multiple sources.
So, was he suggesting that there are parts of the brain that are doing something more than just, basic sensory and motor stuff? Are these the areas that give us those higher level cognitive functions that, that really make us human?
That's exactly it. He was one of the first to really grasp that there are parts of the brain that go beyond just reacting to the world. They're involved in thinking, planning, making decisions. These association centers, they were really the early concept of what we now call the prefrontal cortex, which is like the CEO of the brain, the executive control center.
It's amazing how much he was able to accomplish back then with the tools they had. His work really paved the way for so much of what we understand about the brain today.
He really was a giant in the field. His dedication to scientific rigor and his his holistic view of the mind and body, it's had a lasting impact.
Yeah.
But as we've talked about, he also recognized that some questions, like the nature of consciousness, those might be beyond the reach of a purely scientific explanation.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, how much closer are we to answering that question today? We've got these amazing brain scanners and powerful computers, but can we really say we understand how subjective experience, how those feelings and qualia actually arise from the physical stuff of the brain?
That's the big question, isn't it? And Wundt's work it's a great reminder that even with all the advances in neuroscience, there are still these profound mysteries out there that should keep pushing us to learn more, to broaden our understanding of what it means to be human.
It's humbling for sure. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into Wundt's principles of physiological psychology, I think it's important to reflect on his legacy, what he left behind.
He was a true pioneer, bridging that gap between philosophy and physiology, really championing the scientific method as the way to unlock the secrets of the mind. His work laid the foundation for experimental psychology as we know it.
And even though some of his theories have been refined and updated over the years, those core principles that he championed, the importance of being rigorous and scientific, the idea that the mind and body are interconnected and that the nervous system is this dynamic, ever-changing thing, that those ideas, they're still guiding us today.
His work reminds us that even really complex ideas can be broken down and studied systematically, and that, every new discovery builds on the work of those who came before us.
So as you continue exploring this fascinating world of the mind and brain, remember Wilhelm Wundt, that brilliant scientist, visionary thinker, a pioneer who dared to explore the unknown world of human consciousness.
And who knows, maybe you'll be the one to make the next big discovery, building on the foundation that pioneers like Wundt laid for us.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the world of Wundt and his incredible work. Until next time.